Imagine pitch black darkness, so thick you can't even move a hand. The air is so heavy and hot that every breath burns your lungs. All around you, there is a constant chorus of moans, the clanging of heavy iron chains, and the creaking of wooden planks. You lie on hard wood, and the space above your face is limited to just a few dozen centimeters. This was the daily reality for millions of people who found themselves in the holds of slave ships. Today we will travel back to 1780, to the very height of the transatlantic slave trade. At that time, European empires were actively expanding their colonies, requiring a massive amount of free labor. We will examine in detail why the average modern person would not be able to survive even a single week of such a voyage. This experience went beyond any physical or psychological endurance tests known to us. It is time to immerse ourselves in the harrowing sensory history of the most terrifying sea route in human history. The journey to the slave ship began far from the ocean, deep within the African continent. The captives were forced to walk hundreds of kilometers under the scorching sun without proper rest. This grueling march could last several long weeks, exhausting people even before the main ordeal began. Guards tied the captives together by the neck with wooden yokes to prevent any attempts to escape. Many people died of dehydration and exhaustion right on the dusty African roads. Those who survived the long journey finally reached the coast, where massive stone forts were located. In the 18th century, such fortresses served as transshipment points for European trading companies. People were herded into dark dungeons, which historians often refer to as the dungeons of no return. In these damp and gloomy rooms, the captives might spend several more months awaiting a ship. Conditions there were horrific, but they merely prepared people for the true nightmare that awaited them on the ocean. The process of selling captives to European captains was an extremely humiliating and terrifying procedure. Doctors and buyers carefully examined each person as if they were ordinary livestock at a market. They forced people to jump and move their arms and legs to test their physical strength. Any hidden illness or physical defect could be grounds for rejecting a purchase. Those deemed fit were branded with a red-hot iron bearing the initials of the company or the ship's owner. The pain of the hot brand became the first physical reminder of the loss of freedom. In 1780, this practice was considered a completely standard and legal commercial procedure. People screamed in pain as the red-hot metal touched their chest or shoulder. The smell of burning human flesh was forever etched into the memory of everyone who passed through that courtyard. The burns often became infected in the tropical heat, causing prolonged suffering. This brand meant that a person had officially ceased to be a human being and had become cargo. After the auction ended, groups of captives were loaded into small boats for transport to the ship. The ship itself usually anchored several kilometers from the shore due to the shallow waters. For many residents of Africa's interior, this was the first time they had seen the ocean. The massive waves and endless water evoked a primal, uncontrollable fear in them. They did not understand where they were being taken and often believed that white people were going to eat them. The journey in a small boat through the strong surf was accompanied by constant rocking and splashes of salt water. The ocean in this part of the coast was rarely calm, and the boats were tossed violently by the waves. The captives sat at the bottom of the boat, bound in chains, unable to keep their balance. The fear of drowning paralyzed their bodies, forcing them to cling to one another in panic. Every rolling wave seemed to them a harbinger of imminent and swift death in the depths of the sea. As they approached the ship, its size became increasingly terrifying to the men. A typical slave ship of that era was a massive wooden vessel with tall masts. The ship's black hulls towered over the small boat like impregnable wooden cliffs. The sailors' loud shouts and the flapping of the huge sails in the wind deafened the terrified captives. This massive structure seemed to them like a real wooden monster waiting for its prey. The sailors roughly hauled the shackled people aboard, using rope ladders or winches. This process required considerable physical effort as the captives were weakened and terrified. The clanging of shackles echoed loudly over the water, blending with the sound of crashing waves. The iron rings rubbed cruelly against wrists and ankles, leaving deep, bleeding wounds. Once on deck, a person lost all connection with their homeland. A new phase of their lives began, completely subject to the harsh laws of the sea voyage. On deck, the new captives were met by the hustle and bustle of a huge ship preparing to set sail. Sailors hurriedly loaded barrels of fresh water, food supplies, and extra chains. The ship's captain closely ensured that every square meter of space was used as efficiently as possible. Documents dated April 12, 1780, frequently mention strict accounting for every person on board. The economic profitability of the voyage depended directly on how tightly the holds could be packed. It was at this very moment that the realization of the absolute hopelessness of the situation set in. Behind them lay a continent lost forever, and ahead lay the terrifying unknown of the open ocean. The captives cast their last glances at the thin line of their native shore, disappearing into the fog. None of them knew how long the journey would last or how it would end. Their lives now depended entirely on the ship's wooden planks and the cruelty of its crew. As soon as the captives found themselves on the main deck, they were immediately separated by gender. The men were sent to the bow of the ship, while the women and children were placed closer to the stern. This separation severed the last social and family ties that the people still had. Mothers screamed in horror as they were forcibly torn away from their adult sons and husbands. Sailors used whips and clubs to quickly suppress any resistance to this brutal sorting. To prevent uprisings, all adult men were immediately shackled in heavy leg irons. These irons connected the right leg of one prisoner to the left leg of his neighbor. This system of restraint made any coordinated movement or rapid movement virtually impossible. The iron shackles weighed several kilograms and constantly pulled the weary legs toward the deck. Every movement now required coordination with one's partner in the chain, which caused additional stress. The sensory shock began from the very first minutes on the ship's wooden deck. The air here was thick with the pungent smell of tar, which the sailors had generously applied to the planks. This smell was mixed with a sharp scent of salt water and the sweat of dozens of frightened people. The sun beat down mercilessly from a cloudless sky, heating the wooden surfaces to an unbearable temperature. The prisoners' bare feet were burned upon contact with the hot planks of the main deck. This constant physical discomfort robbed people of their last shreds of composure. Women and children were usually not chained, which gave them the illusion of relative freedom. However, their situation on the ship harbored entirely different, no less terrifying threats. They remained defenseless in the face of the rough and cruel members of the ship's crew. Sailors often took advantage of their absolute superiority, turning the women's lives into an endless nightmare. The fear of violence hung in the air, forcing the women to huddle together in tight, frightened groups. An incredible din reigned on deck, terrifying people no less than physical pain. The creaking of huge rigging blocks and the flapping of heavy canvas merged into a deafening cacophony. Sailors shouted at each other in unfamiliar European languages, using sharp and harsh tones. This acoustic chaos completely disoriented the captives, depriving them of the ability to understand what was happening around them. They flinched at every loud sound, expecting another blow or punishment. An important part of preparing for the voyage was the installation of special wooden barriers on the deck. These tall barricades with sharp spikes divided the ship into several isolated zones. They were built specifically to prevent the possibility of a sudden mass mutiny by the prisoners. In the event of an uprising, the crew could take cover behind these walls and fire their muskets. The sight of these spiked barriers made it clear that any protest would be suppressed with bloodshed. Before sending people to the hold, sailors would often douse them with seawater. This crude sanitary procedure was carried out using large wooden buckets right on the deck. The icy water caused a sharp shock to people weakened by heat and stress. Sailors scrubbed the prisoners' skin with stiff brushes, ignoring their cries of pain. This brutal washing symbolized the final transformation of a human being into a commodity, prepared for transport. After all the preparatory procedures, the most terrifying stage began, the descent below deck. People were led to narrow, dark hatches leading into the belly of the enormous wooden ship. From there rose heavy, foul-smelling air that instantly made one's head spin. Many captives instinctively resisted, refusing to voluntarily descend into this terrifying black hole. Guards had to use brute force, shoving people down the steep ladders. The clanging of chains and falling bodies echoed throughout the ship's holds. By 1780, the loading process had been honed by the captains to a cynical automatism. Every minute the ship idled off the African coast resulted in serious losses for the trading companies. Therefore, the sailors acted as quickly as possible, with no regard for the captives' injuries or maimings. If a man broke his leg falling into the hatch, he was simply dragged aside. Commercial efficiency always took precedence over any basic principles of human compassion. When the last captive had hidden in the darkness of the hold, the heavy wooden grates slammed shut. Daylight gave way to a gloomy twilight, seeping in only through small cracks in the deck. Hundreds of people found themselves locked in a cramped space where they were to spend many long months. The initial shock at the crew's cruelty gradually gave way to the realization of an impending physical catastrophe. The most terrifying part of their lives was beginning, an ordeal that far from everyone managed to survive. The interior of a slave ship defied all laws of human anatomy and common sense. The ceiling height on the lower decks rarely exceeded 1.5 meters at its highest points. This meant that an adult simply could not physically stand upright there. People had to constantly move around hunched over or crawl on all fours in pitch darkness. Wooden beams constantly threatened to crack their heads open with any careless or sudden movement. Captains sought to transport as much cargo as possible, so the holds were equipped with additional shelves. These wooden platforms were positioned between the floor and the ceiling, creating a second tier for housing people. The distance between the shelves was about 70 centimeters, turning them into something resembling narrow wooden coffins. The prisoners had to squeeze into these narrow spaces where they could not even sit or turn over. They lay motionless for hours, pressed on all sides by the bodies of their unfortunate comrades. The rule of tightly packing the bodies was observed by the sailors with incredible mathematical precision and cruelty. The men were laid on their right sides, stacked one inside the other, like spoons in a sideboard drawer. Each man was allotted a space about 180 centimeters long and only 40 centimeters wide. Women and children were allotted even less space, forcing them to huddle into a tight ball. The sailors literally trampled people into the gaps that formed so as not to lose a single precious inch. Breathing in such cramped quarters became physically difficult from the very first minutes of being below deck. The wooden planks of the hold were completely bare, without the slightest hint of straw or mattresses. People's skin was quickly rubbed raw and bloody from constant friction against the rough surface during the ship's rocking. Iron shackles dug into the flesh, creating deep wounds that never had time to heal. In conditions of complete unsanitary conditions, these wounds quickly became infected, causing unbearable, throbbing pain. None of the crew paid any attention to the moans coming from the dark corners of the hold. The lack of personal space completely destroyed human dignity and shattered the psyche of the imprisoned captives. A person could not scratch their face without hitting their fellow sufferer with their elbow. Sleep under such conditions turned into brief periods of restless oblivion, interrupted by screams and pain. Every movement of the bound pair required incredible effort and caused suffering to both participants. People gradually lost the sense of their own bodily boundaries, merging into a single mass of suffering flesh. The darkness in the lower decks of the hold was so thick that it seemed almost a tangible physical barrier. Light penetrated there only through ventilation grates and the rare open hatches during inspections. The prisoners' eyes gradually adjusted to the gloom, but they could make out only the vague silhouettes of their neighbors. This sensory deprivation robbed the people of any ability to orient themselves in the time and space of the enormous ship. Day and night merged into a single, endless torment, having neither beginning nor end. The mind began to play cruel tricks on the prisoners, generating terrifying auditory and visual hallucinations. The noise in the enclosed hold was amplified many times over, echoing off the massive wooden walls and ceiling. The moans of hundreds of people The clanking of iron chains and the creaking of the ship's bulkheads merged into a single deafening roar. This sound never ceased, pounding on the eardrums and preventing the brain from relaxing. The waves crashing against the ship's sides echoed hollowly, sounding like the blows of a giant hammer striking wood. For many, this unending acoustic nightmare became the primary cause of their rapid descent into madness. The temperature in the hold began to rise rapidly as soon as the hatches were closed. The heat from hundreds of human bodies pressed tightly together warmed the enclosed space like an oven. The ship's wooden walls also heated up under the rays of the merciless equatorial sun throughout the day. By evening, the air had become so hot that every breath burned the throat and dried out the lips. Sweat streamed down the captives' bodies in a continuous flow, instantly leading to severe dehydration. In the 18th century, the concept of ventilation in such spaces was at an extremely primitive and dangerous level. Shipbuilders equipped ships with only a few small ventilation pipes, which were unable to cope with their task. The air in the hold quickly became stale, heavy, and catastrophically deficient in vital oxygen. People began to suffocate, frantically gasping for hot steam saturated with the smell of fear and unwashed bodies. This suffocation was slow and agonizing, turning every minute into a desperate struggle for life. Trapped in such a situation, a modern person would fall into a state of deep panic. The inability to move, the sharp pain from the chains, and the suffocating heat would instantly paralyze any will to resist. No modern survival training can prepare the psyche for such a level of brutal isolation. The prisoners of 1780 drew strength only from a primal instinct for self-preservation and the hope for a miracle. For many, however, this descent into the hold became the final journey of their short lives. In early summer 1780, the ship finally weighed anchor and set sail from the coast of Africa. The moment of departure was accompanied by sharp jolts and creaking as the vessel began to pick up speed under sail. The captives in the hold could not see the receding shore, but they clearly felt the change in the rhythm of the motion. The ship left the relatively calm coastal zone and encountered powerful ocean currents. The dull thuds of the waves against the bow became more frequent and much more aggressive. The first days on the open ocean brought a new, incredibly grueling physical ordeal for all the passengers. Most of the captives had never set foot on the deck of a seagoing vessel in their lives, let alone sailed. Their vestibular systems were not adapted to the constant and unpredictable rocking on the giant waves. Seasickness struck nearly everyone in the hold within the first 24 hours. The symptoms came on rapidly, turning the already terrible conditions into a veritable biological nightmare. Nausea began with mild dizziness and quickly escalated into violent stomach cramps. Due to the incredible cramped conditions, people simply could not turn away or move away from one another during the attacks. Vomit flooded the wooden decks, soiling the faces, hair, and bodies of their neighbors in the chain. The sharp, sour smell of stomach acid instantly filled the entire space of the lower decks, intensifying the general nausea. The chain reaction caused literally every person within a few meters to vomit. There was no one to clean up the mess, so the captives had to lie in this filth for days on end. The pitching on slave ships was particularly severe due to the nature of their design and cargo. The ship constantly heeled from one side to the other with a terrifying amplitude. During severe listings, the shackled people slid into one another, forming piles of screaming bodies. The iron shackles painfully tugged at their legs, breaking the prisoners' toes and dislocating their joints. It was impossible to stay in place due to the absence of any handrails or footholds on the smooth walls. Continuous vomiting led to catastrophically rapid dehydration of the weakened and terrified bodies. The prisoners' stomachs had long been empty, but painful spasms continued to twist their bodies day and night. They vomited bile and saliva, losing the last crumbs of precious fluid and vital energy. The headache from the rocking of the ship and the lack of oxygen became throbbing and utterly unbearable. The people begged the guards to give them at least a sip of water, but their pleas went unanswered. The ship's crew, too, was on the brink of physical survival and extreme exhaustion during the stormy days. The sailors struggled with the sails and rigging, having no time to go down to the hold for inspections. They left the prisoners to their fate, ignoring their screams and pounding on the locked hatches. Only when the weather improved did the guards open the grates to assess the damage to the cargo. By this point, the air inside had become so toxic that the sailors often lost consciousness upon descending. After the storm came the stage of assessing losses and cleaning the hold of accumulated filth. Those who had not survived the pitching or had died of a heart attack were dragged up to the upper deck. The bodies were ruthlessly thrown overboard to feed the sharks that always followed the slave ships. For the living, the open hatches meant a breath of fresh sea air and a brief respite before new torments. However, seasickness did not fully subside, returning at the slightest ripple on the ocean's surface. Surviving the first week of rocking without modern seasickness medication was a true feat of endurance. Constant nausea killed the will to live, turning every hour into endless suffering for the exhausted body. In 1780, there were no means of alleviating this condition for the powerless slaves. A modern person would have broken down psychologically by the third day of this merciless biological torture. The departure marked only the beginning of a long list of hardships that the ocean had in store for them. The transatlantic route passed through tropical latitudes, where the sun mercilessly heated the decks of the slave ships. The air temperature inside the closed hold regularly reached 40 degrees Celsius during the daytime. The wood became so scorching that touching the ceiling beams with bare hands was physically painful. This space turned into a giant oven in which hundreds of human bodies were slowly roasting. The heat sucked the last drops of moisture from the captives, leaving them in a state of deep lethargy. Combined with the incredible cramped conditions, the heat created the effect of a stifling, skin-scorching steam room. Sweat evaporated from their bodies, but the moisture had nowhere to go due to the lack of proper air circulation. Condensation collected on the wooden ceiling and constantly dripped back onto the prisoners' faces in dirty drops. This slippery moisture mixed with dirt and excrement, forming a sticky, foul-smelling crust on their bodies. Under such conditions, human skin quickly lost its protective properties and began to rot while they were still alive. The lack of air caused mass panic attacks, which quickly escalated into violent fights among the confined people. In a desperate attempt to get closer to the ventilation grates, the prisoners were ready to kill their neighbors. They bit, scratched, and choked each other with their free hands in the pitch-black darkness of the lower tier. The guards rarely intervened in these brawls, allowing the slaves to fight among themselves for a breath of fresh air. After such fights, suffocated or beaten to death comrades were often left lying on the floor. To cool the sweltering cargo even slightly, the sailors periodically doused the people with seawater from buckets. This procedure brought only temporary relief, as the water quickly heated up on the hot planks of the hold. The salt water seeped into open wounds from the shackles, triggering a new wave of piercing, maddening pain. The evaporation of this water made the air even more humid and oppressive for the prisoners' exhausted lungs. Soon after being doused, the heat would return with renewed intensity, seeming even more unbearable than before. Ship's doctors, if they were even part of the crew, could do little to help the suffocating men. 18th century medicine lacked effective treatments for acute hypoxia and heat stroke. Medical examinations usually amounted to a visual assessment of who was still alive and who was already dead. The corpses were pulled out of the hold using long hooks to avoid infection in that foul-smelling atmosphere. The bodies of those who had died from the heat were often bloated and covered with horrific purple spots from burst blood vessels. The survivors continued to breathe that air, awaiting their inevitable fate. For a modern person, being in such a gas chamber would result in heat stroke within the first few hours. Our bodies, accustomed to air conditioning and clean air, would be unable to adapt to such hypoxia. The cardiovascular system simply could not withstand the extreme strain of pumping blood, thickened by dehydration. Survival in this suffocating hell required superhuman endurance, which far from all the prisoners possessed. Suffocation became an invisible killer, taking lives quietly, methodically, and without the slightest mercy. The feeding process on a slave ship was far from any notion of a normal meal. Prisoners were fed twice a day, usually in the morning and in the late afternoon. weather permitting. The food most often consisted of cheap beans, rice, or coarse cornmeal boiled in water. This bland, uniform mass was carried in large wooden buckets and dumped into communal troughs. No cutlery was provided, so people were forced to eat with their dirty hands directly from these containers. The force-feeding procedure often resulted in severe oral injuries and knocked out front teeth. People choked on their food, coughed up blood, and suffocated when the porridge entered their inflamed airways. Blood-stained instruments were passed from one person to another without the slightest sanitization or washing. Infections instantly penetrated open wounds on the gums, causing severe suppuration and agonizing fever. The crew considered their actions justified, as they were preserving valuable cargo for future sale on plantations. However, the greatest torment on the ship was not hunger, but the constant, maddening thirst. Fresh water was the most precious resource on board, and its supplies were strictly controlled by the captain. Prisoners were given no more than half a litre of water per day per adult. In 40-degree heat and constant sweating, this amount was catastrophically insufficient for survival. People's lips cracked until they bled and their tongues swelled, turning into stiff, unyielding pieces of sandpaper. The water was stored in old wooden barrels that had previously been used to transport other cargo. After several weeks of sailing in the tropics, it quickly spoiled, turning green and acquiring a putrid, swampy odor. Algae and slime grew in the barrels, making this liquid dangerous to drink even for a healthy person. But the captives drank this foul-smelling sludge with the greed of beasts, licking the wooden mugs clean to the last drop. This water often became a source of the most severe intestinal infections, which literally decimated the ranks of the slaves. Old scars and wounds on their bodies suddenly reopened, refusing to heal without the necessary vitamins. Death from scurvy was long and agonizing, accompanied by severe internal bleeding and complete exhaustion. A modern person with a delicate digestive system would not survive even a few days on such a diet. Contaminated water would cause immediate poisoning, and coarse food would lead to a shutdown of the gastrointestinal tract. A constant lack of fluids would quickly destroy the kidneys, leading to fatal intoxication of the body with its own waste products. The brutal feeding rules would break any will to resist, leaving only the animal instinct for survival. Food on these ships was not a matter of caring for life, but merely the maintenance of living cargo. The most terrifying enemy of the captives aboard a slave ship was not the sailors, but microscopic bacteria and viruses. The conditions in the hold provided an ideal incubator for the rapid spread of any deadly infectious diseases. The lack of proper toilets meant that people relieved themselves right where they lay shackled. The crew lowered large buckets down, but in the darkness and cramped quarters, reaching them was practically impossible. Excrement covered the wooden floors in a thick, slippery layer, exuding a suffocating ammonia-like stench of decay. Dysentery, which at the time was called bloody flux, was the leading cause of death during voyages. Contaminated water and appalling unsanitary conditions meant that the disease broke out instantly and decimated entire decks. People would develop severe diarrhea, accompanied by excruciating abdominal pain and massive blood loss. Weakened bodies lost fluids at an incredible rate, turning people into living skeletons in a matter of days. The hold floor was covered in bloody mucus, in which both healthy and dying prisoners lay. In addition to intestinal infections, smallpox epidemics, which periodically broke out on merchant ships, posed a serious threat. In the cramped confines of the enclosed space, the virus spread through airborne droplets with 100% effectiveness in infecting those around them. The bodies of the sick were covered with painful, pus-filled blisters that burst at the slightest friction against the planks or chains. The fever drove people mad, causing them to thrash about in convulsions and tear the skin from their bodies. The bodies of those who died of smallpox were thrown overboard with particular haste to avoid the complete destruction of the entire valuable cargo. Parasites were an integral part of the slave ship's ecosystem, inflicting endless physical suffering and discomfort on the captives. Lice and fleas multiplied in vast numbers in the filth and unwashed hair of the frightened and exhausted people. They bit day and night, causing unbearable itching that was impossible to relieve because their hands were bound. People scratched their skin until it bled, creating open wounds that allowed secondary bacterial infections to take hold. These insects also served as carriers of severe typhus, which added new victims to the ship's log. Eye infections, such as trachoma, afflicted the captives en masse due to the constant presence of acrid ammonia in the air. People's eyes turned red, watered, and became covered with pus, which in the mornings glued their eyelashes shut. Many slaves went completely blind during the voyage, becoming unsellable goods for American planters. The crew often threw blind captives overboard alive, as keeping them was economically unprofitable. Losing one's sight in the darkness of the hold was one of the most terrifying psychological blows for any person. The process of cleaning the hold of waste was carried out by sailors extremely rarely and without proper sanitary diligence. Usually, people were driven out onto the deck, and the lower decks were simply hosed down with salt water from hoses or buckets. The wood deeply absorbed human waste, so it was absolutely impossible to get rid of the smell of decay and bacteria. After such a cleaning, the prisoners were returned to the wet, slippery planks, where they instantly caught colds in the drafts. Pneumonia killed those who had miraculously survived bouts of dysentery and tropical fever in the preceding weeks. Faced with such a multitude of pathogens, the immune system of a modern person would collapse in a matter of days. We have no antibodies to the strains of bacteria that circulated freely in the ship's confined space. Any infection would develop rapidly, meeting no resistance from a body weakened by thirst and stress. The lack of antibiotics and basic hygiene would make survival impossible, even with a strong will to live. Disease was the most ruthless overseer, collecting its terrible toll every day of that endless voyage. The crew of a slave ship consisted of people who were willing to do the dirtiest work for a pittance. Most sailors were recruited in the taverns of European ports, often through deception or under threat of imprisonment for debts. The lives of these sailors were also filled with deprivation, cruelty, and constant fear of the captain's wrath. They took out their anger and frustration on the only beings who were even lower in status than they were. The captives became living targets for the sadistic tendencies of the ship's angry and exhausted crew members. Maintaining strict discipline among hundreds of slaves required a constant display of brute physical force and absolute ruthlessness. The sailors used special nine-tailed whips, known as cats, to punish even the slightest offense or disobedience. The fear of a mutiny constantly haunted the crew, as the number of captives always far exceeded the number of sailors. Because of this, the slightest suspicion of a conspiracy was punished with primitive cruelty, requiring no proof of guilt. Those suspected of organizing a mutiny were tortured in full view of everyone, using red-hot iron and finger-crushing vices. The purpose of such torture was to break the will of potential leaders and force them to betray their accomplices. People mutilated beyond recognition were left lying on the deck as a gruesome warning to everyone else. One of the most sophisticated punishments was hanging a person by their thumbs from the ship's mast. In this position, the prisoner remained under the scorching sun for several hours, experiencing excruciating pain in their twisted joints. The body was stretched by its own weight, breathing became labored, and every movement of the ship caused unbearable agony. Sailors could leave the punished man there all night, exposing him to the icy wind and salty ocean spray. In the morning, the man was taken down, often with irreversible damage to his hands that left him disabled for the rest of his life. The psychological pressure was no less brutal than the physical torture inflicted by the whip or the iron bars in the guards' hands. The sailors regularly staged false alarms, bursting into the hold with muskets and torches in the middle of the night. They fired shots over the heads of the shackled men, reveling in their screams and the general panic in the confined space. This terror deprived the captives of their last shreds of normal sleep and kept their nervous systems in a constant state of shock. The constant anticipation of violence destroyed their minds faster than hunger and disease destroyed their physical bodies. On the rare occasions when the slaves did manage to stage a revolt, the crew's revenge was truly monstrous. If the sailors managed to suppress the mutiny, The ringleaders faced a public and as long and agonizing a death as possible. They might be slowly dismembered in front of the entire crew, or fed alive to hungry sharks over the ship's side. The heads of the executed were often tied to the masts as a terrifying trophy until the very end of the sea voyage. Such cruelty was intended to paralyze the will of the remaining slaves and eliminate any thoughts of future resistance. Faced with such a manifestation of human sadism, a modern person would be utterly shocked. Our psyche is not adapted to perceive such a level of senseless violence and absolute lack of empathy. The absence of any legal protection or hope of rescue would have broken even the most steadfast and courageous people. Pain and fear would have been the only emotions defining every second of existence on that cursed ship. The crew's cruelty was the very foundation upon which the entire system of the 18th century transatlantic slave trade rested. Physical suffering accounted for only half of the horror that people endured while crossing the ocean. Psychological breakdown was no less devastating a process, slowly destroying the personality of every captive in the darkness of the hold. The environment in which they found themselves was completely devoid of any familiar landmarks, smells, or sounds of their homeland. Constant sensory deprivation, combined with unrelenting pain, led to serious cognitive impairments. People ceased to understand who they were, losing touch with their past and seeing no future. Time on the ship passed sluggishly and unpredictably, turning into an endless spiral of pain and fear. In the absence of sunlight in the lower decks, it was impossible to tell day from deep night. The only markers of time were meager meals and rare, escorted trips to the upper deck. Deprived of normal stimulation, the brain began to generate terrifying illusions, distorting the perception of reality beyond recognition. The captives often talked to shadows or tried to brush away non-existent poisonous insects. The feeling of absolute helplessness was the heaviest burden weighing on the psyche of every adult and strong man. They could not defend themselves, could not escape, and could not take revenge on their tormentors for the humiliations they had endured. Their entire lives depended on the whim of the guard, who could kill them at any moment for no reason at all. This forced infantilization shattered their pride and turned grown men into frightened, obedient animals. Many simply gave up, lay down on the planks, and refused to open their eyes, waiting for death to come as soon as possible. Apathy became a defense mechanism of the brain, which shut off emotions so as not to go mad from the unbearable reality. The language barrier exacerbated the sense of absolute isolation and loneliness in the hold, which was crammed with thousands of suffering people. The ship was often loaded with members of various African tribes who spoke completely different and incomprehensible dialects. People could not even share their grief with a neighbor chained next to them, lacking common words to communicate. This Babel-like chaos deprived the captives of the opportunity to find solace in conversation or coordinate joint actions. Loneliness in a crowd of suffering people was an unbearable ordeal for social beings such as humans. Thoughts of suicide visited nearly every captive from the very first days of their stay on the slave ship. The ocean seemed to them the only path to liberation from the endless humiliations and physical pain of the iron shackles. If anyone managed to break free from the guards on deck, they would throw themselves into the raging waves without hesitation. The sharks following the ship seemed to them more merciful creatures than the white men with muskets and whips. The crew stretched special nets along the ship's sides, specifically to prevent these mass leaps. To deprive a person of the right to their own death was the ultimate manifestation of control over their physical body. Modern psychiatry would call this experience the most severe form of complex post-traumatic stress disorder. However, in 1780, no one cared about the mental health of slaves. They were judged solely on their physical strength. A modern person, with a developed sense of individuality and rights, would have gone mad within the first week. Confrontation with absolute injustice and cruelty would have torn our psyche to shreds. This voyage killed not only bodies, it deliberately destroyed the human soul, grinding it to dust. After long weeks of unending nightmare, the outlines of the American continent or the islands of the Caribbean finally appeared on the horizon. For the crew, this meant a quick profit and a long-awaited rest in the port taverns of the New World. For the captives, however, this shore symbolized the beginning of a new, no less terrifying chapter in their enslaved existence. Rumors of approaching land sparked a wave of anxiety and panic in the hold over a completely unknown future. People strained to peer through the cracks between the planks, trying to make out the place where they would spend the rest of their lives. Preparing the live cargo for sail began several days before the ship entered its destination port. It was vital for the captain to give the exhausted and sick people at least the illusion of health and physical strength. The captives were led out onto the deck, where sailors thoroughly scrubbed them clean with layers of grime and dried excrement. This procedure was carried out using stiff brushes and caustic soap, which mercilessly stung open wounds and sores on the skin. For the first time in a long while, the slaves were allowed to stand up straight, though many were no longer able to do so. Their food rations were drastically increased in the final days of the voyage, so that the captives would gain a little weight before the auction. They were given more fresh water and sometimes even small portions of meat or fresh fruit to prevent scurvy. However, their stomachs, accustomed to starvation, often could not digest this unfamiliar food, leading to new bouts of diarrhea. The exhausted people did not rejoice at the food. They understood that they were being fattened up solely for the sake of a profitable commercial deal. The buyer's gaze appraised every kilogram of their flesh, as if it were a cut of beef in a London butcher shop. The arrival at the port was accompanied by deafening noise, commotion, and the appearance on board of a multitude of unfamiliar white people. Merchants, planters, and doctors inspected the captives, lined up in rows with a frightening, businesslike coldness in their eyes. They unceremoniously pried open the slaves' mouths to check their teeth, felt their muscles, and forced them to run across the hot deck. The people trembled with fear, not understanding the language or the intentions of these richly dressed but cruel buyers. Every touch from an appraiser was filled with contempt for human life, which had become a mere commodity. The sale often took the form of a so-called dump, which was the most terrifying experience. Buyers, ropes in hand, burst into a specially fenced pen where a group of terrified captives was held. They would rush at the people, shouting, trying to tie up and brand the best slaves faster than their competitors. In this chaos, families and friends who had managed to stay together throughout the entire voyage were torn apart forever. The cries of children being torn from their mothers were drowned out by the traders' curses and the clatter of gold coins hitting the ground. Those captives who were too sick or weak to be sold immediately were sent to special culling auctions. There, they were sold for a pittance to local doctors for medical experiments or to the poorest farmers in the colony. Many of these weakened people died right in the market square, not living to see the end of the auction. Their bodies were simply dragged aside so they wouldn't spoil the appearance of the more valuable and healthy merchandise. For them, this foreign shore became nothing more than a filthy graveyard far from their native African landscapes. The fate of the survivors was little better, as grueling labor under the planter's whip awaited them. To survive that voyage meant going through a hell that cannot be described in words or depicted on film. Modern people lack both the physical and moral resources to endure such concentrated horror. Our comfortable world is too far removed from the realities of 1780 for us to even begin to imagine what it was like. Studying this harrowing history compels us to cherish our freedom and remember the cruelty upon which the modern world is built. We must never forget those whose lives were cut short in the dark, foul-smelling holds of slave ships. Conclusion: the transatlantic slave trade left the darkest and bloodiest mark in the history of human civilization. A 1780s slave ship was a perfect torture machine, created for economic gain. We have traced this horrific journey from the dusty shores of Africa to the brutal auctions of the New World. Every detail of this journey was steeped in unimaginable pain, suffocating heat, and the stench of death. A modern person would have broken down at any of these stages, unable to endure even a fraction of such hardships. This story teaches us that true evil often hides behind the dry figures of trade reports. An immersive journey into the past, helps us better understand the true cost of the historical events described in textbooks. When reading about the 18th century, we often forget the millions of nameless victims whose sweat and blood paid for progress. The memory of these people must live on so that such crimes against humanity are never repeated. Leave your comments, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with your friends to support our project. See you in the next episodes, where we'll continue to explore the darkest and most terrifying chapters of our shared history.